over. At last, the long wait is over. After 47 years, the Denver Nuggets can finally call themselves NBA champions.
The deal is finally done. The Carmelo Anthony trade saga is finally over. Anthony going to his desired destination, Madison Square Garden, to play with the Knicks.
With the 41st pick in the 2014 NBA Draft, the Denver Nuggets select Nikola Jokic.
It's almost been 2 weeks since the Denver Nuggets won the NBA Finals, and they didn't need to build a super team to do it. They just had a squad of guys that knew their role. They had a perfect team. But how? How did the Denver Nuggets build this perfect team led behind Nikola Jokic? Well, I'll tell you how. Through smart trades, wise draft decisions, and a little bit of luck, they built the perfect team. It all started with a trade. After another disappointing season in 2010, the Denver Nuggets found themselves home early once again. The Nuggets head office needed to make a choice: stay mediocre or hit the reset button in hopes for a brighter future. They smashed the reset button and traded away superstar player Carmelo Anthony. In the trade, the Nuggets would receive Gallinari, Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, and a couple of other players. None of those players really ended up being much. At best, they were average to maybe slightly above average players. But the real secret behind the trade is that the Denver Nuggets would receive a couple of first round picks and a few pick swaps that would be very important later on down the line. To everyone's shock, the Denver Nuggets ended up being pretty decent. They ended up winning 50 games and slid into the 5th seed. They would end up losing in the first round, but they did exceed some expectations. Moving on to the offseason, the Denver Nuggets really didn't do much and made a couple of small trades that really didn't have any impact at all. But in the middle of the season, the Denver Nuggets would make a big time trade. They would trade for a guy who is a legend, who has won many awards. They would trade for JaVale McGee. Moving on to the next offseason, the Denver Nuggets would make a blockbuster trade for Andre Iguodala. Andre Iguodala didn't last very long and was only in Denver for one whole season. During that offseason, the Denver Nuggets would end up firing their head coach and would draft Rudy Gobert, but they would end up trading Rudy Gobert for a second round pick and cash. This is where things started looking very bad. They only won 36 games and would end up being the 11th seed, barely missing the playoffs. But when things started looking very bad for the Denver Nuggets, they would have an amazing offseason. In the draft, they would draft Yusuf Nurkic and Gary Harris in the first round. And in the second round, they would get two-time MVP Nikola Jokic. No one could have saw what was coming. No one knew that the two-time MVP was being drafted during a Taco Bell commercial. In the middle of the next season, the Denver Nuggets would also make a trade for Will Barton, requiring him from the Portland Trail Blazers. They only had to give up a second round pick to get him, which was a steal of a trade. After another bad season, the Denver Nuggets would fire another head coach, and this time they would sign Mike Malone. As for Nikola Jokic, he had a pretty solid rookie season, putting up 9 points per game. During the draft that year, the Denver Nuggets put up a stinker and drafted an absolute nobody that didn't last very long in the NBA. Next year, Nikola Jokic would be thrown into the starting lineup, and that's where things started looking very good for Nikola Jokic. Jokic would go from 9 points to 16 points and would double his assists. With the play of Nikola Jokic and the Nuggets having two young centers on their team, the Nuggets needed to make a trade. They would end up trading Nurkic to the Portland Trail Blazers for Mason Plumlee. After trading for Mason Plumlee, the Denver Nuggets would end up being the 9th seed in the Western Conference, barely missing the playoffs. You can't win all drafts, and in the draft, the Nuggets would end up making the right choice in drafting Donovan Mitchell, but they would trade him away to the Utah Jazz. They would also end up losing Gallinari in free agency, but they would end up signing Paul Millsap, who was a pretty good fit for them at the time. This next season for the Denver Nuggets wasn't really any better than their last one. They had again been the 9th seed, barely missing the playoffs, and in the draft that year, they would end up making a big time move, drafting Michael Porter Jr. at 14. We all know Michael Porter Jr.'s story. He was the #1 high school recruit, but would develop some bad back problems and go down with back surgery. This would tank his draft stock a lot. In the draft, he kept falling and falling. Teams kept passing up on him. That's probably why he doesn't pass the goddamn ball. The Denver Nuggets saw the talent that Michael Porter Jr. had and had to take him at 14. This is where all things started clicking for the Denver Nuggets, and they started thriving in the NBA. With the play of Jamal and Jokic, they found themselves at the 2 seed in the Western Conference. In the first round of the NBA playoffs, the Nuggets were facing the Spurs. They would end up beating them in 7 games. In the second round of the playoffs, they would face off against the Portland Trail Blazers, but would sadly lose to them in 7 games, and their luck had finally ran out. Next year was a very weird year for the NBA. During the offseason, the Nuggets really didn't do much, only a couple of small trades, but then halfway through the season, the NBA would shut down due to outside reasons. The NBA would start up once again in the NBA bubble. In the NBA bubble, the Denver Nuggets would have an historic playoff run. They would make 2 3-1 comebacks, one against the Utah Jazz and another against the Clippers. But sadly, they would fall short in the Western Conference against the Lakers and would lose in 5 games. In the middle of next season, they would make a blockbuster trade for Aaron Gordon. They would give up Gary Harris, who had declined in years past, and RJ Hampton, and a 2025 first-round pick. Aaron Gordon would end up being the perfect fit in Denver, and his skill set was perfect alongside Nikola Jokic. He can be a lob threat, he can cut to the rim, he can knock down the open 3, and he has some great D. Just after acquiring Aaron Gordon, the Denver Nuggets would have some unfortunate luck. Jamal Murray would suffer an ACL tear in a regular season game against the Golden State Warriors. This would mean that Jamal would miss the rest of this season and all of next season. But there was some good news. Michael Porter Jr. had blossomed into a great NBA player and was averaging 19 points per game for that whole entire season. In the playoffs, they would beat the Blazers in the first round, but would lose to the Suns. The Suns just had too much talent and the Denver Nuggets didn't have enough. You can't really blame Jokic for losing in the second round to the Phoenix Suns. They were giving Austin Rivers big time minutes, and that is a no-no. Next offseason, they would sign Jeff Green, but would lose Paul Millsap in free agency. Michael Porter Jr. really started off the season very rough. Nobody knew why. And then a couple weeks into the first season, Michael Porter Jr. would go down with another back surgery and would miss the rest of the year. This left Jokic playing with a bunch of bums. Let's be honest, the only guy on that roster that was even somewhat decent was Aaron Gordon and Jeff Green. In the playoffs, the Nuggets would get bounced out of the first round by the Golden State Warriors, who would go on to win the NBA championship that year. During the offseason, the Denver Nuggets would draft Christian Braun. They would then trade for KCP, and they would also sign Bruce Brown. These were 3 key additions to the Denver Nuggets roster. In the trade for KCP, the Denver Nuggets would be giving up Will Barton and Monte Morris and a couple of second round picks. Nothing too special. KCP and Bruce Brown ended up being exactly what the Denver Nuggets needed. They were the final 2 pieces of the puzzle. The Denver Nuggets needed 3 and D wings, and that's exactly what they got. As for Christian Braun, his minutes were very spotty. Some days he would play 0 minutes, and other days he would give you 15 to 20 plus minutes, but what he showed throughout all of it was hustle. He was a hustler. During the regular season, the Denver Nuggets would absolutely put on a clinic and would clinch the first seed with ease. They would also play Aaron Gordon at the backup 5, which was huge for them because they really didn't have a backup center. The only guy on their roster that's the backup center is DeAndre Jordan, who's like 100 years old at this point. In the playoffs, it was more of the same. They beat the Timberwolves in 5. They beat the Suns in 6. They beat the Lakers in 4. And for the final battle, they beat the Heat in 5. An absolute great performance by Nikola Jokic, and every single guy on that roster knew their role and played it to perfection. The Denver Nuggets are living proof that you don't need a super team to win. You just need the perfect team and players to know their role.